everyone. This is Franz Litz from the World Resources Institute. I'm going to be your moderator today. We're going to hold off just to let a few more participants join. We had a lot more people registered than we see are online. You have joined a webinar series. We're now in webinar 2, sponsored by World Resources Institute, Pew Center on Global Climate Change, and the New America Foundation. This webinar will be on scope and point of regulation, and will feature Judy Greenwald from the Pew Center. I want to welcome both the stakeholders and any state staff that may be on participating in the Western Climate Initiative, as well as the recently announced Midwest Climate Change Accord. And we are hoping, while this series had been planned to help the Western Climate Initiative stakeholders and staff, we are certainly happy that it can now also be of service to those in the Midwest. As I mentioned, this is the second webinar. The third webinar will be next Tuesday, and all subsequent webinars will be on Tuesdays at noon Pacific, 1 o'clock, I'm sorry, is it 11 o'clock? Or will
yes,
11:30? 11 o'clock Pacific, noon Mountain, 1 o'clock Central, and 2 o'clock Eastern. Next week we'll be on electricity sector options, and we will have 2 speakers that have been active in the debate about how to cover emissions from the electricity sector. Dallas Bertroff from Resources for the Future and Rich Cowart from the Regulatory Assistance Project. They will be focusing on 2 mechanisms that have been proposed that can be applied at the state level to cover both emissions related to generation within the jurisdiction and also imported electricity from outside of the jurisdiction. So without further delay, let me just introduce Judy Greenwald. But before I do, you are in lecture mode, those of you listening in, which means we cannot hear you if you raise your voice, but you can be heard if you press *1. If you do press *1, you'll be added. Well, those of you who registered the interruption in the window have figured out how to put questions in for Judy as she goes. Judy is Director of Innovative Solutions at the Pew Center and has held various roles in Washington, including Hill staffer for legislator. She also worked in the White House, and she is now directing and really heads up Pew's work on both technology and state and regional action, and has been a huge asset to, as those of you involved in Western Climate Initiative and those of us who were involved in RGGI can attest, has been a huge asset to regional initiatives to design a cap-and-trade program. And I've seen Judy give this scope and point of regulation. This is sort of her topic, as you're about to see. So sit back and enjoy. Register questions in the box or hit *1 to be added to the oral queue. It's all yours, Judy.
Great. Thanks so much, Franz. So this is the first of the deep dives into specific cap-and-trade design issues. Many of you were on last week when we did the Cap-and-Trade 101 overview, and we talked about many of the design questions that come up. And this is the first and one of the earliest design questions that one has to address, which is the scope of the program and the point of regulation. And so turning to the next slide, which is what is scope and point of regulation. Hopefully everybody's slides are moving along with me. Scope of coverage is the question of what greenhouse gas emissions are included in the cap-and-trade program. And that would mean what greenhouse gases, what sectors, what facilities, what types of facilities, what size thresholds, what fuels, are combustion emissions included, process-related emissions, embodied emissions in products. And then the point of regulation question is who has the obligation to surrender allowances to match emissions? As you may remember from last week, the fundamental requirement for a cap-and-trade program is that an entity who's covered by the program has to hold enough allowances to match their emissions. There aren't all that many other requirements to the program. When we do a cap-and-trade program, we're giving those who are covered by the program a lot of flexibility about how they're going to reduce their emissions, or even whether, if they want to buy emission allowances and emit more, or reduce their emissions and sell emission allowances to others. That's their choice, but they must have enough allowances to match their emissions. And so who has that obligation is the question of who's covered by the program, or what the point of regulation is. And there are a lot of choices, there's a range of choices on this. Upstream, and that's where greenhouse gases enter the economy or close to that. Downstream, where the greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere. There are other entities who you might want to cover who aren't really strictly upstream or downstream. There are hybrids where you'd cover some folks downstream, others upstream, and also mixtures where some parts of the economy are covered by the program, but you also use other kinds of complementary policies and measures to cover other parts of the economy. So that's what we're going to work through today. So the next slide, is key considerations. The way most people think about this is that you have some competing objectives with scope. You want to maximize the breadth of the coverage, taking into account administrative feasibility. And that can sort of take you in a little bit in two different directions. You know, you would want to have more coverage, which might mean more sources, but on the other hand, you don't want to have a lot of little sources. The integrity of the emissions data is key. You want to have data available. You want to be able to measure, monitor, and report emissions data going forward at the point of regulation. And you just want to make sure that you can sort of get the numbers right. You know, too large a number of sources, you could make the program too administratively complex if it's small sources, and too small means you don't have as much of a market, and you don't get that opportunity to actually have a trading and active market. So the next slide, these are moving kind of slowly, so I'm not hitting it right. It's, are other people able, Laura or Franz, can you move the slide to the next one? Because it's, oh, there it is, it went. So what are upstream and downstream? And that's kind of the, one of the early questions that we ask. And that refers to the position of greenhouse gases as they move through the economy from production or introduction into commerce to emission into the atmosphere. And downstream generally means at the point of emission, sort of imagining a smokestack, or, I mean, generally you can't see CO2, but they would come out of a smokestack. Upstream is sort of a term of art, and it can have somewhat different meanings, but generally what upstream means, it's at a choke point that's towards the upstream end of the spectrum. For example, an oil refiner or an importer, a natural gas processor, a coal prep plant. And this would be a facility where a lot of fuel moves through those facilities. But it's not all the way upstream generally, such as a coal mine, we could actually cover coal mines, but it would be extremely difficult, for example, to cover oil and gas wells, you know, to go all the way upstream, because there's just too many of those. And what you're doing in upstream, which is somewhat different from downstream, is upstream, you're covering these entities for the carbon content of the fuel that they're moving. So it's a carbon content requirement. And ultimately, what you care about is that that carbon is going to get emitted into the atmosphere. But the point that you're picking is really about carbon content of fuel moving through the system, whereas downstream, you're actually looking right at the emissions. So moving to the next slide, hopefully. This is first of a number of figures that I'll show to sort of get a sense of what this looks like. If you look at the spectrum, which is along the top, it's showing along the top the spectrum from upstream to downstream. Sort of left is upstream. As you move to the right, you go downstream. And, you know, sort of a purely upstream set of entities would be extraction of the fuels, extracted coal, extracted natural gas, extracted crude petroleum, and there's a lot, particularly in natural gas and crude petroleum, there'd be a lot of entities, a lot of oil and gas wells. Then most of those fuels then move through another set of facilities, and this would be more the upstream choke points that a lot of people talk about, maybe a natural gas processor or importer, petroleum refiners. Also moving a little bit further down on natural gas into transmission pipelines are also mentioned as a possible upstream choke point, although it's, you know, it's toward the upstream end, but it maybe would be more midstream. And then as you move all the way downstream, that's where those big emitters are underneath where it says downstream: electric generators, large industrial and commercial sources, small industrial sources, and residential. There's a lot of those that would probably be difficult to cover. And then transportation, that would be every vehicle. So, if every vehicle is a downstream emitter, and that would be difficult to cover all of those individually. And then kind of off of the spectrum are other types of entities, such as first sellers or load-serving entities in the electric power industry, and we're going to talk about this on the webinar next week, that there's some interest in covering folks who sell electricity or the retailer of electricity. They're not actually moving carbon through the economy. They're moving electricity, and in order to make that electricity, you had to generally use up carbon or emit carbon dioxide in the generation if you are actually, you're not actually moving the carbon, but what the electricity that you're moving has what we call embodied emissions, that in order to get to where you actually are moving electricity around, somebody had to generate it and produce some emissions. So you would be covering those kind of indirectly. And similarly, you could cover vehicle manufacturers, hold them responsible for the emissions from the vehicles they produce. But again, the vehicle manufacturers themselves aren't moving something that has carbon in it. They're making vehicles. Those vehicles emit CO2. So you could make the manufacturers responsible for those emissions. Okay, so I'll make a little bit of a highlight natural gas, because natural gas is sort of the most complicated of the fuels in terms of how it moves through the economy and where the right point is to find a point of regulation. As we talked about before, there's lots and lots of places where we extract natural gas, a lot of it outside the U.S., or a fair amount of it, for example, Canada and Mexico. And then a lot of that does move through processors, but a fair amount doesn't. There is a fair amount of gas that comes out. It can go right into a pipeline. Most of the gas does move through the pipeline system in some ways, but there's both interstate and intrastate pipelines. And a lot of that goes through to local distribution companies, but a fair amount of gas actually bypasses local distribution companies and goes directly to large sources. So it's tricky to find a point for natural gas where you can sort of, a choke point where like all the gas moves through. So natural gas is kind of the hardest of the fuels to cover upstream. Generally, people have views that they come to this debate with in terms of whether they tend to be interested in upstream or downstream. The case for upstream is that you get the most comprehensive coverage at the smallest number of facilities. And generally, the more coverage you get, the tendency is you can have lower costs. We talked a little bit about this last week, where you just get more gains from trade if you have more coverage. There's more opportunities, more entities are covered. Some of them will have a greater likelihood that they can reduce emissions at lower cost. They'll be able to sell allowances, for example, to folks who face higher costs. So more coverage helps you keep the program cost low. There's also the possibility of lower administrative costs because you'd have smaller numbers of entities. And there's also the view, and this tends to be in support of upstream, that the response to a price signal is independent of the point of regulation. So some folks feel that it doesn't really matter. If you cover folks upstream, they will have to hold allowances to match their emissions. There'll be some costs associated with that. They'll just pass those costs down through the economy, and everyone in the economy will see that price increase, and then it just turns into a price signal that people would respond to, whether they're required to comply or not with an allowance obligation. In terms of downstream, see if I can get to the next slide. There's a longer set of arguments that get made in support of downstream. This slide is not advancing. It's okay. Why downstream? This is sort of several issues come into play. A lot of folks have the view that the point of regulation does affect behavior, so it actually does matter where you put the point of regulation, and that the idea is that emitters generally have more compliance options than fuel providers, and that therefore it's appropriate for the regulated entities to be the one that has options. So this is sort of a set of ways of viewing how businesses comply that would lead you toward being in favor of a downstream approach. Also, most of our real-world experience is with downstream, the acid rain program, the Eastern NOx program, the European trading system, or there's a little bit of upstream experience where substitutes are clearly available, such as with CFCs, which is not the case, of course, with fossil fuels, at least not yet. We can't completely substitute for fossil fuels. So at the moment, when you cover a fossil fuel upstream, they don't have a lot of options other than to pass the cost downstream. Facility-level data availability is an advantage for downstream. We already report CO2 emissions for electric power plants. There's protocols and data collection for that are easily expandable to other large stationary combustors. If you look at, for example, how New Jersey did mandatory greenhouse gas reporting, it was a very, very easy rule change. They just added carbon dioxide and methane to their list of air contaminants. So then every facility that was already reporting their air emissions for other kinds of pollutants then just added this to the list. And so it was a very sort of administratively simple to just add that into the process. And then also, when you do downstream, that automatically awards CO2 emissions reducing technologies such as carbon capture and storage, not just technologies that reduce fuel carbon content. And since we're very interested in moving forward with those kinds of technologies, having that be inherent in the system is an advantage. And also there's some interest because you could phase in coverage over time. You might have the big electric generators, and then you would then perhaps add others over time. So you could sort of start with sources you think are relatively easy and then add others over time, whereas with upstream it's a little bit more all or nothing. Okay, and I'm seeing a little traffic about that. We may have gone off and on. Are we okay now?
I think we're okay, Judy.
Okay. All right. Then, so the sort of interesting thing about how this argument often gets played out is that there does appear to be some tendency among people who work on the energy area to think more in terms of carbon and fuels moving through the economy, and there is some tendency among those who work more coming out of the environmental area to think more in terms of CO2e, which is carbon dioxide equivalent, and emitters. And there does appear to be some tendency among economists to think that the point of regulation doesn't affect behavior, and some tendency among regulators and some businesses to think it does, although I've heard folks who are economists who think the opposite, and regulators and businesses who think the opposite of that. So this is not sort of for sure, just sort of a way of thinking that folks often come to. But the good news is that, even if you can come at this with these perspectives, it's actually hard to be a purist on this. And though people may start that they tend to be have a preference sort of coming towards this issue for upstream or downstream, that actually once you get into it, pragmatic considerations move you along the greenhouse gas chain. So, for example, on non-CO2 gases, there is a consensus emerging that certain kinds of non-CO2 gases you really need to get at upstream because otherwise you wind up with a lot of little sources, and that others you really do want to go downstream because there's really no way to get them upstream. So you wind up that for certain kinds of sources it's just obvious how to cover them. And on processed CO2 emissions, again, you really want to cover the large sources downstream because you really can't get at that upstream because it's not about carbon content of fuel. It's about how that process actually produces CO2. And there does seem to be convergence on at least some issues. We just saw that the bill that came out of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, which is a hybrid approach, is covering coal downstream. It's covering oil and gas upstream. And to some extent, that's because as you move along the spectrum for coal, there actually isn't all that much difference in terms of the number of entities between going downstream and upstream. So, and the downstream has a lot of ease of coverage because it's generally these large power plants are big combustors. So at least at the moment, you don't hear too many people advocating covering coal upstream or some of these process sources, but there's still debate about the others.
Judy?
Yes.
We have a question that you might want to cover here.
Okay.
And the questioner says, this may be covered later in the presentation, but doesn't an upstream system involve a lot of assumptions about the amount of emissions that will eventually come from a given amount of fuel, natural gas or coal?
Yeah. Yes.
How,
Yeah.
how are different technologies and efficiencies in the downstream users' combustion of the fuels taken into account?
Yeah, I mean, if you're covering the carbon upstream, I mean, all of that carbon pretty much is going to turn into CO2. So you can I mean, we're pretty good at figuring out the translation from carbon into CO2. The big issue, the technology that you don't take into account is something like carbon capture and storage, where we're actually removing carbon. And what you have to do then, if you do upstream, is that you have to have some kind of credit for that. So it's sort of makes it a little bit more complicated. But, even if you have a very efficient system, that means that you'll be able to get more work out of the energy that you're using, but all of the carbon in your fuel is going to wind up to be CO2 because that's just how combustion works. The carbon it combines with oxygen and it becomes CO2. So we're pretty good at in terms of just making sure that you can account for the carbon and translate that into CO2. But I think it is an issue about carbon capture and storage that has to be dealt with. So the issues are, depending how you think about this question, what should be how we deal with oil and gas, how you deal with buildings and transportation, and there may be some outstanding issues on particular non-CO2 gases. Some special considerations for states in this conversation. Most of this that we've talked about, or pretty much everything we've talked about so far, is kind of equally applicable to national and state and regional programs. But for states, upstream is a little bit more problematic, and that's because the upstream source, there's a good chance it's out of state. So you may not be able to get that choke point that would make sense at a national level. You just may not be able to do that at the state level. And so to do upstream at a regional level requires covering imports, and you wind up that the program is a lot more about figuring out what's imported into the region. And that can be difficult because sometimes it's hard to distinguish, or it can be often hard to distinguish fuels destined to be used in region from out of region, and the regional boundaries might change as you expand the program. So this becomes a sort of whole new layer of complication. It's also difficult to cover vehicle manufacturers at the state or regional level. And for electricity at the state level, a key issue is how to deal with imports, and we're going to have a webinar talking about the electricity issues next week, and that's why there's some interest in covering a load-serving entity or a first deliverer of electricity. So looking at some pictures of what this can look like in terms of the different hybrid options, this would be where you cover oil and gas upstream and coal downstream. As I mentioned, this was in the Senate bill, the Lieberman-Warner bill that just came out of the full committee of the Environment and Public Works Committee of the U.S. Senate. And what they're doing is they're covering oil and gas upstream, at the natural gas processors and importers in the case of gas, at the petroleum refineries and importers in the case of oil. And then they're covering coal downstream. And as you can see from these circles, there's red circles around electric generation and large industrial and commercial sources. And the circles don't completely cover the box, and that's because it's only these big sources that are burning coal that are covered in this manner. The oil and gas is covered upstream. So those circles are meant to not completely cover those boxes. If we do this option where you cover oil and gas upstream and coal downstream, some of the considerations are that it does send a price signal to consumers. For the oil and coal piece, it's actually the most comprehensive coverage at the fewest sources, and this is upstream in the case of oil and downstream in the case of coal. You get a lot of coverage at a relatively small number of sources. An issue is that there are no compliance options for the covered entities for the natural gas and oil points, other than reduced sales or buying allowances and passing on the costs. And there is incomplete coverage of natural gas, as I mentioned earlier, because that industry, it's sort of hard to find the right point. Particularly if you add up between processors and importers, there's still about 15% of the gas that's not covered. And there can be an issue that there's just not all that many entities, which, there's sort of a pro and con to having fewer entities. Just to give some sense of the numbers we're talking about, for oil at about 150 refineries, you can cover most of the sector. For natural gas, we're talking about 530 natural gas processing plants, and this is nationwide. And just to give a sense, for California example, there are 120 natural gas processors, and then interstate pipelines and pipelines from Mexico can cover a lot of the gas that's coming in between the processors and the pipelines. Another hybrid, which I'll call hybrid number 2 for no particular reason, this would cover the large sources downstream, and notice in this case is the electric generators and the large industrial and commercial sources are complete circles, so everybody, no matter what you're burning would be covered by, all the emitters would be covered. And then you would go to the local distribution companies to pick up the small users, the residential and commercial combustors. And those LDCs would then have to make sure that they only covered the gas that they were moving to the small guys and not cover the gas that they're selling to larger users. And they do distinguish by customer class, so they could do that, but it is an accounting complication. And then the petroleum refiners and importers would cover transportation fuels, and so you'd get that kind of coverage. And there's actually two variations of this where you could have also cover the heating and the oil that's used for heating. You could perhaps pick up, or you would just pick up the transportation fuels that way. And some considerations are that we already collect data on electric power plants. It's easy to expand to large combustors. Some of this we've talked about before. Some would argue that you would want to cover combustors similarly they may be using different fuels, but you may want to cover them in the same manner. And it's the combustors that have the efficiency and fuel switching options, also to get at this promoting carbon capture and storage. And we do need more exploration of the local distribution companies. Not a lot of people have focused on this. These local distribution companies who move gas, essentially your gas retailers, can implement efficiency programs, but it is important that they are regulated in such a manner that they can still make profit even if they increase the efficiency. And so something called decoupling, where a gas utility's profits are decoupled from their sales so that they continue to earn revenue even if they do efficiency, would be important. And there's a number of innovations in the regulatory in regulation of these entities where you could try to get those incentives right. And there are some of these accounting issues that that I mentioned. Okay, and then hybrid number 3 would be large sources downstream, and you'd cover the gas local distribution companies for the residential and commercial gas, and then you would pick up transportation by regulating the vehicle manufacturers. And we're advancing kind of slowly again. Advancing, oh, there you go, okay. We talked about many of the advantages and disadvantages of these pieces. The particular issue for vehicle manufacturers, if you can cover them and you get at a big chunk of transportation, and you can make them responsible for the emissions of the vehicles that they manufacture, but there are other uses of oil and the rest of the transportation sector that you wouldn't be picking up. And so that's an issue for going that way.
Hey, Judy?
Yes.
Sorry to do this. If we go back to slide 2, there's a question related to slide 2. Or, I'm sorry, hybrid 2.
Hybrid 2.
How are non-emitting generators treated in hybrid 2?
Oh, generally what we talk about with covering a facility there in either upstream or downstream, you're actually covering folks who either have the potential to emit, they're moving fuels that will emit somewhere downstream, or they're actual emitters. And we don't actually talk about covering non-emitters. If you're not emitting, that's an advantage. You don't get covered. And so then you become more competitive against other sources who are covered. So that's the that's the idea of the program, is that you're not actually requiring, if somebody doesn't emit, then they don't have to hold allowances to match their emissions because they don't have any emissions. Okay, are you moving? Okay, so hybrid 4, and this would be another variation where you would, it's sort of a smaller program, you would just cover the big sources downstream, and then you would have regulatory standards for transportation and buildings. You wouldn't try to cover them under the cap and trade program, you would just treat them through other policies and measures. And as we talked about, there are advantages to covering large sources downstream because of the experience that we have and the other reasons why people like that sort of a program. But there are considerations. Economists often will point out that standards can be less economically efficient, although others point out that if you have a market barrier that you actually can use standards to correct that market barrier. So there's debate about that. We do have a lot of successful experience with standards, and it may be that both standards and a price signal are necessary for particular sectors or categories of sources. A particular sector that comes up as coming up with a lot of questions or competing goals that you have for the sector is transportation. And the sort of key options for transportation, there are several. One is to cover oil upstream. We saw a couple examples of that. It's comprehensive. It sends the price signal with every gallon used. But the covered entities have limited compliance options, and consumers the price signal would get passed down to ordinary consumers, and they're relatively unresponsive to gasoline price changes. Another option, which can actually, several of these can actually be combined, but another option is a low carbon fuel standard. It's comprehensive. That takes into account the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. You actually look at the whole, the greenhouse gas emissions that were used in producing the fuel, as well as when carbon dioxide is emitted when the fuel is burned. But life cycle analysis is challenging, so it's good to look at the whole life cycle of how the fuel is made, but it's hard to do that. It doesn't put a hard cap on emissions. A low carbon fuel standard is really kind of an intensity standard. And all things equal, it's not as economically efficient as cap and trade, although as not all things are always equal. Additional options on transportation are to cover the vehicle manufacturers. The vehicle manufacturers do have lots of compliance options. They are price responsive. They're used to meeting CAFE compliance or fuel economy standards. However, they have no control over vehicle miles traveled, so making them responsible for those emissions, they're not going to be able to control that piece. The emissions would have to be estimated. You're not going to know in advance for sure how many emissions are going to come out of a vehicle that you sell, so there's some uncertainty. There's no price incentive, fuel price incentive to discourage driving or motivate interest in efficiency, so you're sort of putting everything on the vehicle. And initially your coverage is low because if you're just covering new vehicles, but that can grow over time as new vehicles penetrate the market. And of course there are other options. There's CAFE, which is being debated now in the Congress, and vehicle greenhouse gas standards, which California has proposed and there is involved in a lawsuit over, and 15 states around the country are poised to adopt California's vehicle greenhouse gas standards. Another issue that comes up with transportation is if you do cover it through a cap-and-trade program, should it have its own cap-and-trade program in a separate market or be part of a broader market? And the competing goals there are that a broader market is more economically efficient because you would find the least cost solution among all the sectors, and if transportation has fewer opportunities, then they would do less, and utilities might do more. However, if you do put transportation in with the broader market, you could bid up the allowance price for the total economy without getting much additional reduction, because the assumption being that consumers or that drivers are less, ordinary drivers are less price responsive than other parts of the economy. And so there could be an issue with the rest of the economy not being able to reduce rapidly enough without resorting to very high CO2 prices to drive demand reduction. And you may want greenhouse gas reductions in the transportation sector for co-benefits reasons, for energy security, dealing with traffic congestion. So it may be that you have reasons beyond just the climate change issue for getting some reductions out of that sector. And it also may be that we need more than one tool to address transportation because there's so many different actors. Just a little bit about other examples, and we're going to have future webinars where we go into these previous examples of cap-and-trade in greater depth. We have the U.S. acid rain cap-and-trade program that was electric sector only, SO2 only, and the obligation was at the source or the emitter. We have the Northeast NOx budget program, electric and industrial combustion sources, NOx only, again, the obligation at the source of the emissions. The EU ETS, the emission trading system in Europe, is a multi-sector cap-and-trade on emission sources. It covers only CO2 and covers a variety of sectors, so it's a downstream program, electric generators and other combustors in various industrial sectors, and these critical industrial sectors that have a fair amount of CO2 emissions: oil refineries, iron and steel, cement and lime, glass and ceramics, and pulp and paper. And there is some role for offsets in the EU process. You can do projects overseas and through the clean development mechanism in developing countries, and those who are complying with the EU ETS can use those projects as a way to demonstrate compliance. But in terms of broader coverage, this is the coverage of that EU ETS system, but you can get a little bit of expansion through overseas offsets. RGGI, or the Northeast Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, is an electric sector-only cap-and-trade program for emissions, and on the emission sources at the generators, also covers only CO2. That does have some role for offsets as well, so there are some other kinds of activities that can be brought in separate or brought into the as a means of compliance, even though those other categories aren't initially capped or given an emission reduction obligation, but they can be brought in as offsets. And RGGI has talked about adding sectors over time and having a broader program, but there's no move as of yet to expand beyond the electric sector. In terms of the electricity sector cap-and-trade design, and we won't get into too much today, but we'll talk about this next week, there are load-based designs. There's been interest in this by Oregon and the California Public Utility Commission, among others. And this is where the load-serving entity or the electric retailer is required to hold allowances to cover the emissions attributable to the power that they deliver. And that's one way of getting at imports, since the retailers would be covered for all of the electricity they're supplying, whether they import it or whether it's generated in state or in region. And then there's the first seller or first deliverer approach that the California Market Advisory Committee talked about, and that's being discussed in California. And that applies to the first seller or deliverer of electricity in a state, which can mean either the generator in the state, which would look like a generator-based program for that portion, and the first seller or deliverer into the state of electricity generated out of the state, and that's going to be whatever entity, a power marketer or some other entity who might sell to a load-serving entity or retailer. And we're going to be talking about these and perhaps other options next week. Let's see. Yeah. If anybody's advancing. There we go. Okay. So in terms of, how do you go forward and think about how to make decisions about scope and point of regulation? And the way that we've been thinking about this is that you first want to look at the decisions in existing programs, sort of look at what the experience has been and what they've learned and how well that's worked and what the implications of that have been. And then you would look either sector by sector or fuel by fuel, or in some ways both. You want to look at the data issues. You would want to look specifically at the transportation options, because that's an especially little bit of a complicated sector to think about. You'd want to consider the phasing in of sectors over time, and you want to spend a little time on natural gas, because that one's a little bit complicated, and thinking through about how you may want to cover natural gas particularly. And you also may want to develop straw proposals covering scope and point of regulation and data gathering, and sort of compare and contrast. So a way through this, for example, so just sort of illustrative on the next page, for each sector or fuel, you would want to think about, do you want to include this? If so, what would be your point of regulation at the emission source, at the fuel source, other? Is it feasible? What's the availability of data going through it? You have sort of this kind of an exercise to think about, what it is that you want to include in the program, and make some decisions. And then from this decision about sort of who's in and who's out, a lot of other decisions flow, because depending on who you're covering, that will determine what's left over to use for that you would need to deal with through other means or mechanisms, or that might be available, for example, as offsets to the rest of for the program. So let's see. I didn't stop for questions as much as I had meant to, so we'll have to do the questions now, but let's get into the discussion part.
Okay, Judy. For those of you interested in asking oral questions, I see there's one person in the queue. Others can join the queue by punching in *1 on the phone, and then you'll be added to the list. Let me go to some of the written questions that have been here for a little while. This one is more in the it's not really a question, but I'll state it anyway. We should recognize that some large industrial sources do burn petroleum products.
Yeah, and that is an issue. You know, one of the reasons why some folks talk about regulating oil upstream, but only for the transportation, is so that you can avoid that double counting issue if you did a hybrid. So if you did a large downstream program where you included everybody who burns oil, coal, or natural gas, and then you just covered the transportation port upstream, you'd have less of this issue. The problem is if you try to do a hybrid program where you're covering the big sources downstream for oil, and then you're also trying to cover the rest of the oil upstream, you have some accounting issues that you have to deal with. So that is an option, and that is something that people are looking into, but it's a little bit tricky.
Second one here is greenhouse gases in the U.S. dropped last year, which is a rare event. Some folks attribute the drop to consumer response to the price of gasoline. Do you agree that the higher price of gasoline, whenever a new question comes in, it throws the question up, has had an effect on consumer use of gasoline?
You know, we have not yet delved into that report about what exactly happened to emissions, so I don't really have an independent view. I mean, it's certainly possible that that was part of what caused the drop. It is, you know, emissions are sensitive to economic activity of all sorts and in all sectors, so that is certainly possible. The problem we have for the driving sector, for the driving public, is that they're not all that responsive to gasoline prices. And, you know, a lot of the driving that people do is not really discretionary. So there isn't a lot of immediate response to fuel prices as much as one would like. Over the longer term, you do get more response. You know, people make decisions about the kind of vehicles that they drive and the kind of choices they make about their commuting routes. But in the very short term, it's hard to get a lot of response on gasoline in terms of gasoline demand to gasoline price, although there's certainly some, and that may have been part of what drove the reductions that we saw.
Okay, let's take the first oral question, and would the callers please first identify yourself before stating the question?
Hi, this is Peter Rode with Energy Washington. I just wanted to point out that the California Federal District Court dismissed the lawsuit by the automakers against California for their greenhouse gas emissions regulations. So I guess that leaves it up to EPA to decide what to do. Just a couple of questions. What about chemical manufacturers that use either natural gas or oil as feedstocks? And what about cross-sector trading, with one sector trading with another? For example, you know, automakers trading with chemical producers or something. Where would that fit in?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of an economy-wide program is that everybody could trade with each other. So you could have, you know, the coal generator have extra allowances. They could sell them on the market, and they could be bought by, you know, if we covered it this way, by the auto manufacturer or by an oil refiner, however we did it. So the idea of an economy-wide program is you would cover different sectors differently, but they could trade. It would be, you know, a completely unified market. There are people, though, who do argue for separated markets for the reasons I think I explained about transportation, that there's some nervousness that there are certain particular sectors or subsectors that could bid up the price for everybody else, and that could be an issue. And other people, the counter-argument is that then overall we'll still get the lowest cost. So it is worth having that extra demand in there for allowances to get overall the lowest economic cost for the economy as a whole. So there's a tension there between you know, people who would like to sort of break off some parts of the program versus others who want to keep it all together and get as big and thick a market as you can so that you get the most economically efficient result.
Okay, from the written list here, can you reiterate and or expand on your previous discussion of how decoupling might be considered in cap-and-trade design?
Yeah, I mean, what cap-and-trade really relies upon is folks responding to price signals. So if you are a utility and you have to buy allowances to match your emissions, and that's a cost, and you're going to be passing that cost through to consumers, you know, that's a cost that you have to take into account. However, if one of your options, for example, might be to advance demand-side efficiency, and that might actually be from a broad economic perspective, that might be the most cost-effective thing to do would be to improve demand-side efficiency. But that might mean that you as a utility would then sell less electricity, and it works the same way in gas, and then you would lose money. So that would be sort of a disincentive for you to do the most economically efficient response to the price signal that we're putting on for cap and trade. So in order to kind of align those incentives, you really want to make sure that utilities at least don't have a disincentive to do the least cost response to the allowance price that you're putting in the economy. So the idea is to at least make sure that they would be kept whole. For example, if they sold electricity, that they would, if they sold less electricity, they could still earn the revenue requirement that had been agreed upon by their regulator. And there are a number of states who do this. And then some folks would advocate going even further, where you actually give utilities extra incentives or even requirements to move towards demand-side efficiency, so that sort of improves that side, the incentive to use that mechanism for reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Explain the difference between point of regulation and allocation method.
Excellent question. So point of regulation is sort of who's got the responsibility, who has to comply, who at the end of each compliance period has to say, these are my allowances, these are my emissions, and they match. And then you're in compliance, and if you're not in compliance, you're the one who's fined, or you're the one who's held accountable. So that's sort of, the point of regulation is the entity that's responsible for that particular, for complying with the law or the regulation. Allocation is what we do with these emission allowances, either initially or on an ongoing basis. And it could be that you, for example, the government would hand out some of the allowances to those who are covered, and you might do that for free, perhaps initially to ease transition costs. Or the government might auction those allowances, and then folks who are have to comply would have to buy them from the government. Or you might give out allowances for free, or you might use auction proceeds to deal with folks who are not directly required to comply. They're not the covered entities, but that they're going to feel some effect of the program. So, for example, utilities might be covered by the program, but it might be the consumers who actually are the ones who actually feel some cost from the allowance requirements that we've placed on the utilities. So it might be that, for example, there would be an auction of allowances, and then some of those proceeds might be used to help out consumers who might be hard hit by price increases that were the result of the program. So how you deal with allowances and how you give them out or sell them is a lot more to do about distributing the costs of the program, whereas who's covered and who's got the requirement is more about who should be the one to actually be required to be the one to demonstrate compliance. And often it's the same point. You would often give out allowances, or the folks who would buy allowances would be the ones who are covered, but sometimes it's not, or often it's not. And we're going to have a separate webinar on allocation.
Next, it will be an oral. Go ahead and ask your question. Hello? All right, I'm going to take the next one.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, sorry, the computer was not letting me do that. This is Brad Upton with NCASI. From the discussion this morning, it appears that the cap and trade program would not really be concerned about keeping track of combustion-related methane and nitrous oxide emissions. I recognize those are very small in relation to combustion CO2, but is that the case, that for combustion processes you'd be predominantly concerned with CO2 only, and that you'd be capturing, you know, like methane and nitrous oxide from other sources where the magnitude of those emissions are greater?
Yeah, I mean, if you do a downstream program, you could do all of those at one place because you'd have a large enough facility. It would be difficult to do that in some of the other methods because, for example, methane from pipelines is kind of, they're sort of fugitive emissions. It would be hard to find one point where you could actually catch all those emissions. But certainly wherever you have a large facility that's emitting, if you're going that route, you can catch multiple gases. And you could have, you could have an upstream program on the carbon, and then you could cover folks downstream for their non-CO2 emissions. So that is possible as well. But those are trickier to pick up in large enough quantities where you can easily track and report and have them be part of the cap-and-trade program.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
The follow-up is in regard to biomass fuels, which of course have not been discussed. And for most greenhouse gas reporting programs, CO2 from biomass combustion is not included with direct emission tabulations, but methane and nitrous oxide emissions from biomass combustion are. Have you given any thought to this wrinkle?
Not really. That is one of the reasons why people like the low carbon fuel standard, because then you're looking at how the fuel is made, and then you can also make you can create incentives for making biofuels in a more climate-friendly manner. The biofuel that is made with the least life cycle greenhouse gas emissions would have an advantage. So that is one of, it's because of biofuels, I think, that a lot of folks are interested in a low carbon fuel standard to try to get that life cycle greenhouse gas emissions correct. But you're right, I mean, these other non-CO2 emissions from these fuels are going to be important, and they're just harder to catch in a cap-and-trade program.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that was the last oral question. If anyone else would like to ask oral questions, just hit *1 on your phone. But we have quite a number. We have quite a number of written ones. So let's take the next one. How necessary is it for new mandatory reporting regulations and methods specific to the natural gas sector? How necessary is it that they be developed? Or can we base a regional market on existing data we have now?
I'm not sure I have an opinion on that. Actually, Franz, you may. Certainly we want to make sure that whatever we're including in the program, they can actually report their emissions. And I think that you can make tentative decisions based on what we know now and the data that we have available. But once you actually are about to get a program up and running, the more you know about the particular emissions that entities are emitting, the better off you are. Now, there is the sort of phenomenon, whenever you regulate something, you get better data. So in a way, the process or the act of deciding this is the sector that we're going to regulate, these are the entities who we're going to regulate, you'll get much better data because of that. Once they're regulated and the light is shown on them, then you'll actually get better data. And there is sort of there's competing goals about whether you want to do mandatory reporting in advance of a program or have some kind of learning phase, for example. That's what the European Union did, where they actually started the program and kind of got their data as the program started to get up and running. And there's sort of pros and cons to that. I'm probably more oriented toward trying to get mandatory reporting in advance if you can. But there are folks who think you just get the program up and running and the reporting in the same time frame, and then you just make sure that in your early phase you leave some flexibility for adjustment based on what the data is showing you. I don't know, Franz, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the European Union example illustrates what happens when you have bad data, and as a result, your cap is very, very lax. And the answer is you have a zero carbon price, and then you move on. But bad data could also result in the opposite, that your cap is much more stringent than you thought it was. And that may, I mean, I'd leave it to you to decide whether that result is, is easy to recover from for a new program. So I'd agree with Judy that the better the data at the start of the program, the more likely you'll have a good outcome. I'd also agree that when you're making the scope decisions early on, the preliminary decisions about what you're going to cover and where, you probably don't need, for lack of a better word, regulatory grade data. But as you move closer to actually establishing the cap in the cap and trade program, better have data that you can rely on. The next question. Sorry if I missed this. Oh, sorry. This is, can we get hold of the PowerPoint? Yes, the PowerPoints will be emailed to everyone who registered for this particular webinar. What have been the most effective point of regulation programs? Upstream, downstream, hybrids? Why would you even give consideration to a CO2-only regulation program when other GHGs are more damaging on an equivalence basis?
As I think I said earlier, most of the experience we've had has been with downstream programs. You know, that's what the EU ETS does, that's what RGGI's doing, that's what the U.S. acid rain program was, that's what the Eastern NOx program is. I mean, that's where we've had most of our experience. But there is a lot of interest in covering fossil fuels upstream because of this point that you can actually get a lot of the fuel, sort of cover a lot of the fuel at a relatively small number of facilities. And since most of the emissions come from CO2, you can sort of get at most of it by going upstream and doing carbon dioxide. But yeah, with that kind of program, you would lose the non-CO2 gases, although you could do a hybrid program where you cover a lot of the carbon upstream, but you cover the non-CO2 gases through a hybrid again, because there are actually some non-CO2 gases that you want to cover at their point of production. SF6 is an example of that. When you emit SF6, it's at lots of little points, whereas if you could cover the manufacturers, that's a way to get at that. So I think for both the non-CO2 and the and CO2 gases, you can do hybrid programs where you cover those sources that make most sense to cover upstream and others downstream. And but you definitely do want to try to get at the non-CO2 gases to the greatest extent possible, because you know, per molecule they're a lot more they have a lot more warming potential, and so often you have very cost-effective opportunities there. But we know less about them. We're less good at measuring them than CO2. So there are folks who think, you know, sort of start with CO2 and then worry about those other gases later.
Next question is, what's the perceived benefit of a first seller approach over a load-based approach? That's going to be covered next week. Do you want to take that anyway, Judy?
Why don't we defer that to next week? Because that's basically, I mean, that's kind of the core of the conversation for next week, but we will talk about that.
Yeah, that's in fact, if there were one question to summarize that webinar, that's it. How are new entrants dealt with? What is their baseline?
That's generally not covered yet in the scope decision. I mean, the scope decision is more, you know, who's covered, and you know that the new entrant would be covered. I would think about new entrants, the issue as being more of an allocation issue. You know, when a new entrant comes in and they're in a covered sector, or they're, you know, in a group of entities that we've defined as covered entities, the question is, you know, if existing sources got free allocation, should that new entrant get a free allocation? And people deal with that in different ways. You know, some folks have sort of a new source set aside, so that if a new source comes in, they would get some free allowances allocated if those existing sources in their sector were treated similarly. If you have more of an auction kind of approach where existing sources aren't getting allowances, then it becomes less of an issue. The new source coming in would be treated just like everyone else. But if you do have a system where you're giving out free allowances to existing sources, you have to think about how you're going to treat the new ones coming in. But that I think of that more as an allocation issue than a scope issue.
This next one also foreshadows a future webinar. I haven't seen the final markup of the Senate climate bill, but the version as it was introduced, it appeared to restrict the types of offsets. It appeared to restrict the types of projects that could be used as offsets. What's the argument for restricting the types of allowable offsets? Shouldn't the market be neutral on allowable projects? Carbon is carbon. And after all, if the project meets additionality, verification, and permanence requirements, why shouldn't they be allowed?
Yeah, I think they've gotten a little bit more liberal on the offset categories that can be included. There's a little bit more flexibility for EPA to add categories of projects for offsets in what came out of the full committee versus how the bill was introduced. But there are issues with offsets. If you just make the standard, you know, any project is fine, it's very difficult to administer. And because you could get all kinds of different projects, and reviewing these projects is complicated. So this was actually an innovation that RGGI did, the Northeast Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is that they started with a few project types where they knew they could do good protocols, do good measurement, you knew that you could get a valid offset that you were sure could meet your additionality criteria, the other criteria that people usually apply to offsets. Additionality means that the reduction wouldn't have happened anyway, that it's actually really an extra reduction that you're getting for the benefit of the environment. And so to sort of help streamline that process, what RGGI did is they had a set of offset categories. If you do a project of this category and you meet this protocol, you know that you can get that project approved. And that kind of speeds the project approval process and gives greater confidence to folks who are skeptical about offsets. So it's kind of a compromise between those who are nervous about offsets and project developers who want some certainty about what an approved project might look like. And so the Senate bill has taken some of that idea where they have some certain kinds of categories that are clearly counting, and then they also have given flexibility to EPA to add categories. And I believe, and this is something that changed a couple of times between the bill introduced in the subcommittee and the full committee, but I believe there's still a quantitative limit on how much of your requirements can be met through offsets, because there is this concern about making sure that offsets, because they're not capped sources, that there's less certainty about the environmental benefit of offsets sort of broadly, so you only want to limit their role. Other people think, as long as they meet the criteria, there shouldn't be a quantitative limit, and that's a debate.
And I would just note that webinar number 6, which is currently scheduled for Tuesday, January 22nd, will bring some Hill staffers up, and the ones that we're intending to get, I'm not sure if they've confirmed yet, have been very active in the Warner-Lieberman development of that bill.
Right, and to some extent we'll have to see how the Hill schedule goes for those guys.
Next one is, to what extent will covering the natural gas sector cause consumer behavioral changes? That is, what is the sensitivity of individual family consumers to the price signal?
Yeah, I mean, we have sort of the same problem for homeowners as we do for drivers. They're the same people. And, ordinary consumers of natural gas and ordinary drivers who buy gasoline, both of them are not as responsive to price signals as economists would like them to be. So I really think in both cases, for transportation and for natural gas, you really need help from some other entities. You need complementary standards. In the case of vehicles, you need vehicle standards. In the case of natural gas, you need equipment and appliance standards. And also in the case of natural gas, you would need a role for the local distribution company to work with customers on efficiency programs, and similarly on the transport side, you really need other entities besides just relying on the consumer to respond to a price signal, unless you're willing to take a pretty hefty price signal, because it would take quite a hefty price signal to get consumers to respond just to a price signal on its own. You're probably going to do better when you're talking about getting ordinary consumers to respond if you have some complementary policies where you have the price signal, and that will help encourage people to buy more fuel-efficient vehicles, for example, but you also have standard to get you more fuel-efficient vehicles so that those two things can work together.
Next one, how can a program adapt to changing geographic scope, such as from individual states to regional or national or even international programs?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way is if you have a downstream system, then, the state comes in and all of their emitters then get brought in. If you have an upstream system, it's a little more complicated, because as you would add a state, let's say, to a region that's covered, the points of import into the region would have to probably change, and you'd have to adjust, because, before something would have been coming in from outside the region, but now if it's now covered, it's now inside the region. So there is in both cases, you're going to have to make some adjustments, but it's a little bit harder. We've never done this before, but we think it would be harder to add states to an upstream program than to a downstream program, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It's just that would make it harder.
Okay, and here's the next one. Did the bad data in the EU ETS in part result from the use of different emissions accounting methodologies from one member state to the next? The WCI states each seem to be independently designing and adopting their own methodologies for which emissions get reported. How are they quantified, or how they are quantified and reported and tracked, what emission factors to use, etc. While the claim is that these approaches are consistent, quote unquote, isn't the WCI likely to face the same difficulties that the EU faced if sufficient consistency and uniformity is not achieved in the design of the WCI accounting protocols?
Wow, okay, that's a lot of questions. The Western Climate Initiative is not only working on designing a cap-and-trade program, but they've also committed to jointly do emissions reporting and registries, and they're also, I believe all of the member states of the WCI are also members of the Climate Registry, which is working to have, nationally uniform standards for reporting and measurement. So I think that they are working to coordinate that. And in fact, I'm confident that they're working to coordinate that so you won't have sort of differences state by state on that front. In terms of the EU ETS, I think part of it may have been different protocols, but I think more of it was just people hadn't really had to report this before. So they just didn't really have the information, and it just turned out that their estimates based on what they knew were just off once you actually told people to report. And as I mentioned, that's kind of a phenomenon that those of you who have regulatory experience and may be familiar with it, sort of once you actually regulate something, you just get a lot better data because it's everybody who either emits that or has responsibility for it pays more attention and then tries to get the numbers right. And so I think it was much more a phenomenon of that they just didn't have very good data, and because people hadn't been paying attention, and then once they paid attention, they found out that they had really been way off in some particular sectors.
What I would just add to that is the reporting, the mandatory reporting that you're referring to in the WCI states started their various developments prior to the WCI launch, by and large. So what you have are inconsistencies that grew up before they really sat around the table together. So going forward, I think what Judy said would probably apply. And that's the end of the questions, Judy.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
Any other, let me just double check here on the, to make sure that we don't have anybody in the queue for an oral question. Hey, Laura, are you there? Could you confirm whether there's anyone in the queue? I seem to have lost my screen.
Hey, Franz. Nope, it's all clear.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So that with no questions left, Judy, I don't know if you have any closing remarks.
No, I just we're really glad that people are participating. Franz and I and others who are involved in this are happy to answer questions, either offline or as we do more of these webinars. So please let us know, how we're doing and if we can be of help. And Greg is asking how many people are on the line today.
Okay, I can tell you that. Well, right now there are 43, but at one point it was up close to 80. I don't know if you saw a higher number, Laura.
No, it's about 74 is the highest I saw.
Okay.
And Lee Alter is saying, I had my hand up for 5 minutes. Please double check voice queue.
Okay, hold on one second. Hold on one sec. We'll get you.
I don't see one up there now.
Lee, hit *1 on your phone. Again, see if that works.
And Greg, while we're waiting for Lee, Greg is asking about the slide decks, and we're going to be posting them shortly, right, Laura?
Yep.
Okay, Lee is saying, can you comment on expanding scope to additional sectors in the future as with additional states? Well, as I think I mentioned, if you're going downstream, that's easier to do than if you're going upstream.
Is that you, Lee?
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead.
Good job.
Well, thank you for taking my question.
Oh, okay. So I think that the written one must be the question. So I think for downstream, you could start, for example, with electric generators, and meaning to pick on them, but you could start with that, and then you could add industrial, and then you could add transportation. So you could actually expand the scope to add sectors over time. If you do go with an upstream program, unless you go sort of fuel by fuel, which I guess is possible, you could cover coal, let's say, and then you could later cover oil and then natural gas. You could do upstream, but generally, when people talk about adding over time, that's more in the context of a downstream program. This is discussed a little bit in the California Market Advisory Committee report if people are interested in further reading, and you could look at that. We did talk about the possibility of first going for the large downstream sources and then adding the other perhaps the more upstream pieces of the program over time once you sort of got experience with that. And we're also getting a question. I haven't received the slides from the first seminar. Have they been sent or are they archived for download?
Laura?
Hi, this is Laura. We have, I will be sending out those, the slide presentations. It's quite a large file, so we just have a few little technical problems. And we would like to put them up. We are planning to put them up on a website, but the details have yet to be nailed down. So, but we'll send a notice to everyone so that everyone will have access to them.
And if you have a dire need, you can always email Laura, right, Laura? And you could
Sure.
email them individually.
Sure.
And
yep.
you will have her email.
That's the Burns at newamerican.net.
Okay. That's it. Okay, so next Tuesday the 18th, and all of the subsequent webinars will be on Tuesdays, is Rich Cowart from the Regulatory Assistance Project and Dallas Bertraw from Resources for the Future, and look forward to hearing you all on that date. And otherwise, we're signing off. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.